Most teams begin their Azure journey by opening a subscription, creating a virtual machine, and picking services as they go. The better starting point is much less exciting, but it saves a lot of pain later. Decide why you're moving, what you're moving, and what rules people need before they begin. Think about opening an office. You could rent random rooms in different buildings, hand out keys without a list, and hope each department figures out its own internet, filing, and security. People could still work for a while, but it wouldn't feel like one office. Or you could prepare one safe building where people know where to go, who can enter, what each space costs, and who fixes problems. That's what the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, often called CAF, helps you do. It's Microsoft guidance for moving work into Azure and then running that work over time. We're going to look at its 6 building blocks, what an Azure landing zone really means, and why governance can't wait until the end. One part is skipped by many teams, and it often forces a rebuild later. Why CAF exists, the office building problem. Before cloud services became common, many companies built their IT bit by bit. Email ran on one server, file storage ran somewhere else, an application had its own server, its own backup plan, and sometimes its own person who knew how it worked. Security decisions could differ from one system to the next. One team managed networks, another managed servers, finance received bills, but often couldn't see which department caused the spending. The setup grew over years, usually because each new problem needed a quick fix. Azure gives you more options, faster. That doesn't mean Azure automatically fixes cost, security, or slow delivery. If you create cloud resources without shared decisions, you can recreate the same old mess, only with more buttons and a monthly bill that changes every day. CAF is Microsoft's map for avoiding that. It isn't a product you install. It isn't an Azure certification. And it isn't a one-click setup that turns an empty Azure subscription into a finished cloud environment. Instead, it gives you a way to think through the work. You decide why the organization needs Azure. You plan what should move. You prepare a place for workloads to live. Then you move, protect, govern, and run them. Back to our office building, the business owner decides what the building needs to support. The reception desk checks who is allowed inside. Each department works in its own room. Building rules control access, safety, and spending. Meanwhile, the facilities team keeps the lights on, responds when something breaks, and checks that the building remains safe. Azure works in a similar way, although the parts have different names. Imagine a company that wants more space for new products and remote staff. It wants teams to build faster, but it starts by letting every team create Azure resources however they like. One team uses public access because it's quick. Another creates expensive services without a budget owner. A third can't connect its application because nobody planned the network. Soon, nobody knows who owns what. Bills arrive with little context. Access becomes too broad. Fixing the setup means changing systems that people already depend on. That's the cost of treating cloud adoption like a shopping trip instead of an office move. SAF helps teams make those decisions before the confusion becomes normal. The first question comes before blueprints, subscriptions, or virtual machines. Why does this office need to exist at all? Strategy and plan. Decide why you are building. Strategy starts with a simple question. What problem should Azure solve for your organization? Not, which Azure service should we buy? A company might need to leave a data center because old hardware needs replacing. Another might want to release new features faster. A business with teams in different countries may need its applications closer to those users. Someone else may care most about recovering from an outage without waiting for damaged hardware to be repaired. Those are different reasons. They lead to different decisions. Think about an office move. Are you moving because the current office is too small? Do you need a second location? Are remote staff coming in more often? Or does the old building simply need too much work to keep running? You wouldn't choose the same building for every situation. Azure works the same way. Your strategy should name the outcome you expect. Maybe you want to reduce how much you depend on your own data center. Maybe product teams need to release updates more often. Maybe remote staff need safer access to business systems. Or maybe finance needs clear spending limits before cloud costs start to grow. Use plain measures where you can. For example, move these 10 servers before their support ends. Or cut the time needed to release a new version from weeks to days. Or give each department a monthly cloud budget that has an owner. That gives people something real to work toward. Without this, cloud projects drift. The technical team builds resources. The business waits for results. Finance sees a bill. Security finds risks late in the work. Then everyone asks the same question: why are we doing this? Once the reason is clear, planning turns that reason into a work list. You need to know what applications you have, what data they use, who owns them, and which people understand how they work. You also need to know timing, risks, skills, and dependencies. A dependency is simply something an application needs before it can work. For example, an old payroll application may need a database, a shared file location, and a connection to another business system. If you move only the application and miss one of those links, the move may look complete, but payroll stops working. This is where many teams find surprises. An application that looked small may connect to 5 other systems. A server may run a task nobody documented. The only person who understands it may have left years ago. Planning finds those problems while you still have time to deal with them. Then you choose a path for each application. Some applications can move as they are. This is often called rehosting or lift and shift. You take the existing server and run it in Azure with few changes. Others need some adjustment to work better with Azure. You might move a database to a managed Azure database service, for example, while keeping most of the application the same. Some applications need a larger rebuild. Their code may be old, hard to support, or too tied to the old environment. In other cases, it makes more sense to replace the application with an online service, or keep it outside Azure for now. Keeping something where it is can be the right choice. Cloud adoption doesn't mean moving every single thing. But here's where teams often make a bad first choice. They start with the oldest, least understood application because it feels urgent. That application may be fragile, poorly documented, and connected to more systems than anyone realizes. It can turn the first move into a long rescue job. A better first workload is important enough to teach you something, but simple enough that people understand its owner, its data, and how success looks. That first move gives the team a chance to learn without putting the whole business at risk. Imagine a company whose server hardware support ends in 3 months, and its first goal isn't to redesign every old application. There isn't time. Moving a few servers to Azure with limited changes may be the sensible move because it removes the immediate hardware risk. Then the company can create a longer plan to improve or replace those applications later. That isn't settling for less. It's choosing the right job for the time available. Planning also needs the right people in the room. Business leaders explain what matters. Application owners explain how the software works. Security teams define safe access. Network teams plan connections. Finance tracks spending. The cloud team builds and supports the Azure side. No one team can answer every question alone. So, strategy tells you why the office needs to change, and planning tells you who is moving, what they need, and when it can happen. The next CAF phase prepares the building around those needs before the first department arrives. Ready? Build the landing zone before tenants arrive. With the plan in place, you can prepare Azure itself. SAF calls this phase ready. The central idea is the Azure landing zone. That name can sound technical, but the meaning is simple. A landing zone is a prepared part of Azure where applications and data can live safely. Think of it as preparing the office building before the first department moves in. You need the building shell. You need electricity, network cables, doors, locks, fire exits, and a place to store records. You wouldn't invite people into an empty concrete floor and tell them to sort out the wiring themselves. A landing zone gives your workloads that prepared foundation. It doesn't mean every Azure environment looks the same. A small company may need a simple setup with a few clear rules. A large company may need many separate areas for teams, regions, and sensitive systems. The point is to build the parts you need before applications arrive. Start at the reception desk. In Microsoft Cloud Services, Microsoft Entra ID works like that desk. It manages digital identities, which means it knows who is trying to sign in and can help decide what they're allowed to access. A person might need access to one application but not another. A service may need permission to read from a database but should never be allowed to delete it. Entra ID helps manage those decisions. The general rule is simple: give people only the access they need to do their job. That keeps mistakes smaller and makes unwanted access harder. Next comes the layout of the building. Azure has a few layers for organizing work. Management groups sit near the top. You can think of them as the wider property structure, where shared rules can apply to more than one area. Subscriptions sit below that. A subscription is often a separate space for billing, access, and workloads. One might support a production application. Another might support testing. A shared subscription might run services used by many teams. Inside subscriptions, resource groups help you collect related Azure items together. An application's web service, database, and storage might sit in one resource group because they belong to the same workload. Naming rules and tags help people find things later. A name tells you what something is. A tag is more like a label you attach to it, such as the department owner, the environment, or a cost code. If finance needs to ask which team caused a charge, labels make that question much easier to answer. But don't turn names and labels into a giant puzzle. People need rules they can follow without opening a 20-page document. Clear and consistent beats clever. The building also needs roads, doors, and walls. In Azure, this is networking. It controls how systems connect to each other, to the internet, and sometimes back to systems that still run in your own building or data center. Some applications need a private path to a company database. Others need to accept traffic from customers on the internet. Some systems should never talk to each other at all. That separation matters. You wouldn't leave every office door open just because people work in the same building. In the same way, a good network design allows the connections a workload needs and blocks the ones it doesn't. Then there are services that many departments share. Identity is one. Network connections are another. Monitoring, backup, and security tools can also sit in this shared platform area. Rather than every application team building its own version of those basics, the organization can provide them once and let workloads use them. This is often called a platform landing zone. An application landing zone is different. That is the individual office space where one application or team works. It follows the wider building rules, but it has room for the needs of that workload. For example, a customer website may need different services from an internal finance system. They can have separate application landing zones while still using the same sign-in rules, network approach, monitoring, and security controls. This gives teams room to work without turning Azure into a free-for-all. Azure policy helps with that. Policy acts like building rules that prevent unsafe choices. You might require certain labels, so costs have an owner. You might block storage that allows public access when the data should stay private. You might limit deployments to approved regions. The goal isn't to stop people from working. The goal is to stop common mistakes before they become expensive or risky. But this is where many beginners get stuck. They see a huge Microsoft diagram full of boxes and decide they need every box from day one. You don't. A small team doesn't need to build an enterprise tower just because the blueprint exists. Build the foundation your organization needs now, then add to it when a real workload gives you a reason. And that first workload tells you something a diagram never can. A landing zone can look complete on paper, with policies, networks, access rules, and monitoring all neatly drawn. Then an application arrives and needs a connection nobody planned, a permission nobody expected, or a backup setting that doesn't fit. That isn't proof the landing zone failed. It's how the building becomes better. Adopt. Move workloads in, learn, then improve. Now people can start using the space. CAF calls this adopt, and it covers two related jobs: moving existing workloads into Azure and changing workloads so they work better there. A workload is simply a piece of work that runs on technology. It could be a website, a business app, a database, or a group of services that work together. Picture a department arriving on moving day. The room is ready, but the move still needs care. Staff test their entry cards. They check whether their phones work. They make sure they can reach the files they need. They find the emergency exits before a real emergency happens. Moving an application to Azure follows the same basic idea. You check that the application works, that it can reach the systems it depends on, and that the right people can support it. Start with a workload that gives you a fair test. It should matter to the business, but it shouldn't be a mystery held together by old code and one missing manual. Move it, test it, learn where the setup needs work, then use those lessons on the next workload. That is how CAF avoids the same mistake repeating 50 times. There are a few paths an application can take. The fastest path is rehost. You may also hear people call this lift and shift. The application stays mostly the same, but it runs on a virtual machine in Azure instead of a server you own. This can make sense when you need to leave old hardware quickly. The next path is replatform. The application still does the same job, but you move part of it to a managed Azure service. For example, instead of running your own database server, you may use an Azure database service that Microsoft runs and maintains. Then there is refactoring or rebuilding. Refactoring means changing parts of the application so it can use cloud services better. Rebuilding means creating a new version because the old one no longer fits the business need, costs too much to maintain, or cannot safely move as it is. Not every workload needs to come to Azure. An application may stay where it is for a good reason, or the organization may replace it with an online software service instead of running the application itself. The right answer depends on what the workload does, how much change it needs, and what risk the business can accept. Before anything becomes a production workload, test more than the sign-in screen. Does the application do its normal job? Can it talk to the database and other connected systems? Does it perform well when real people use it? Can you restore the data if something goes wrong? Do the right people have access while everyone else stays out? And do you understand what it costs when it runs normally? A successful deployment is not just an application that opens once. It is an application that can run, recover, and be supported. This also needs two groups to stay involved. The application team knows what the application needs and how users rely on it. The platform team knows how Azure is set up and which shared rules apply. Neither team can solve every issue alone, but many organizations fall into a familiar trap. The platform team finishes the landing zone, gives the application team access, and moves to the next task. Then the application team hits a policy, network rule, or permission issue and starts looking for ways around the platform. That creates frustration on both sides. A better approach is to treat the first few moves as shared work. When an application needs a reasonable change, the teams decide whether that change belongs in the application setup or the shared Azure foundation. They document the answer, then make the next move easier. Each workload teaches you something. Perhaps the backup process needs a clearer owner. Maybe an application needs a network path that other workloads will also need. Maybe a policy blocks a safe deployment and needs adjusting. You don't wait for a perfect design before learning these things. You learn by moving carefully, improving the setup, and using those improvements again. Once departments are working inside the building, though, someone must keep watch over the rules, safety, and daily upkeep. Govern, secure, and manage. Keep the office safe and running. Govern, secure, and manage are not jobs you leave until the migration project ends. They run through the whole cloud journey because decisions about access, spending, safety, and support affect every workload from the start. Governance sets the rules for how Azure is used. That can include which Azure services teams may use, which regions they can deploy into, how resources are named, what labels they need, who owns each workload, and how spending is tracked. Think of governance as the rules everyone agrees to follow while using the office. A department may need to state who owns a room. It may need approval before installing costly equipment. It may need to follow rules about where sensitive records can be stored. Those rules are there so the office remains understandable as more people move in. In Azure, governance also helps with compliance. If your organization must follow rules for customer data, financial records, or health information, you need to know where that data lives, who can access it, and whether the required controls are in place. Security focuses on protecting the people, systems, and data inside that environment. Entra ID helps control sign-ins and permissions. Conditional access can check the situation around a sign-in, such as whether the person is using an approved device or needs an extra sign-in check. Microsoft Defender tools can help spot threats and suspicious activity across the platform. The idea behind all of this is least privilege. People receive the access they need for their work, not broad access just because it feels easier. An application receives only the permissions it needs to. That may sound slower at first, but broad access creates a much larger problem when an account is compromised, a person makes a mistake, or a contractor no longer works with the company. Management is the daily work that keeps Azure running. Someone needs to watch the monitoring alerts. Someone needs to check backups and prove that data can be restored. Someone needs to install updates, respond to incidents, review costs, and decide what happens when a service stops working at 2 in the morning. These jobs happen behind the scenes, but users notice quickly when nobody owns them. There is also a shared responsibility model in cloud services. Microsoft runs and protects the underlying Azure cloud. Microsoft looks after the physical data centers and the core cloud services. Your organization still owns the responsibility for what it puts into Azure, how it configures services, who can enter, how data is protected, and how workloads are operated. Moving to Azure does not remove those responsibilities. It changes how you handle them, so write down ownership in plain terms. Who receives an alert when a database fails? Who can restore a backup? Who approves access for a new employee? Who responds when Defender reports a threat? Who checks whether a workload is spending more than expected? If the answer is someone in IT, it is not an answer yet. A common failure looks harmless at first. A team turns on monitoring, dashboards appear, and alerts begin to arrive. Everyone feels safer because the warning system exists. Then an alert fires at night. Nobody receives it, or several people receive it and assume somebody else will act. The alert becomes background noise. A small issue grows because the system reported the problem, but no person owned the response. Monitoring without ownership is just noise. Rules need balance as well. Too few rules can leave private data exposed, spending uncontrolled, and resources impossible to track. Too many rules can push teams to find ways around the official path because they cannot get their work done. Good governance gives people a clear, safe path forward. It does not turn every request into a long argument. CAF helps you revisit these choices as the organization changes. A new application, another region, a new compliance need, or a different way of working may require updates to the rules and the support model. The framework does not end when the last workload moves. It stays useful because the office keeps changing while people work inside it. Conclusion: use CAF as your map, not a checklist. Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework turns Azure from a pile of separate services into a planned place where people, applications, data, security, and costs have clear ownership. Its 6 connected parts are strategy, plan, ready, adopt, govern, and manage. They are not boxes to tick once and forget. They help you ask better questions before a quick decision becomes an expensive rebuild. Try this with one workload you already know. Write down why the business needs it in Azure, who owns it, what could go wrong, and whether the right path is to move it as it is, change it, replace it, or leave it where it is. Then check its destination. Does it have clear identity and access rules? Does it have the network connections it needs? Are monitoring, backup, and cost ownership already decided? Keep the scale sensible. A small team needs a smaller office, not a giant enterprise tower full of empty rooms and rules nobody understands. Next, look at Azure landing zones. That is where this prepared foundation becomes visible in Azure through the structure, shared services, and rules that workloads inherit when they move in.